Welcome, everybody. I am Henry Blodget. I'm the editorial director at Business Insider. Very proud and pleased to be working with Microsoft and the rest of the panel on facial recognition. This is one of the technologies that is advancing at such a rapid rate that even if you are tuned into technology, you often don't have a good sense of how fast it's advancing and how positive it can be for the world and how potentially dangerous as well. And we have a wonderful panel this morning to talk about this. Brad Smith is the president of Microsoft. Maricha Shaka is a member of European Parliament. Ken Roth is the executive director of Human Rights Watch, and Kay Butterfield is the head of AI and machine learning for the World Economic Forum here in Davos. So we will talk about that. And to start us off, Brad, can you give us an overview of where the technology is and ultimately just a sense of what it can do and what it can do to hurt us as well?
I will, thank you, and I'll just frame this for a few minutes so that we have a sort of a level set for the conversation to follow. But on behalf of Microsoft, let me also say thank you for coming. Welcome this morning. Having come before dawn, it's always a part of every day, it seems, in Davos. It's great on behalf of the company to welcome you. We have Eric Horvitz, who both leads Microsoft Research and has probably forgotten more about artificial intelligence than all I've ever learned. But it's great to have him here. Penny Pritzker, who's a member of our board of directors, is here, and we're delighted to have all of you. I'll just take a few minutes to talk about artificial intelligence and the explosion, if you will, in the public policy issues that it is creating. And I always think it's worth starting, as we think about this issue, by reflecting on something we all know but really never think about. We all developed the ability to recognize people's faces from our earliest months of being alive. We could tell the difference between our mother and our father, or a sibling and a babysitter. And of course, this kicks in very, very early in life, and it continues throughout life, even if we can't always remember everyone's name, especially at a place like Davos. Well, here we are in the year 2019, and it turns out that increasingly computers can do the same thing as human beings. Facial recognition has been a topic of discussion among computer scientists since the 1960s. So why now? Why is it exploding this decade? And I think it's really because of four different technological developments that have really all come together. One is the improvement in cameras, 3D as well as 2D, and the ubiquity of cameras. Both cameras like closed circuit cameras, but cameras really everywhere, including in everybody's pocket and purse and the phones that we carry around. But it's more than that. It's the massive accumulation of data really made possible by the cloud, the availability of broad computing power and data storage in the cloud that has really made that computing capability available to almost anyone. And then by definition, the ability to use so much more data than before. And then ultimately advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning in particular, with neural networks and the ability to tell people apart. So suddenly we find that computers can do what humans can do. And in part it's because it turns out that our faces can be reduced to a set of mathematical equations. As we all sort of know, our faces are unique. There are different distances between our pupils. Our noses have unique shapes. There is the shape and size of our smile. There is the cut of our jaw. All of this can be reduced to mathematics and ultimately to algorithms. And this technology is rapidly changing the world. We're going to talk about the challenges it creates, but I do think it's helpful to remember it's doing a lot of good for the world, and it will do a lot of good for the world. There are many different scenarios that are emerging, and it's just worth noting a few of them. One is for consumer convenience. The National Australian Bank is working so that a customer can walk up to an automated teller machine and instead of having to use a credit card or debit card, simply have one's face recognized and then type in the PIN for security purposes. That's a relatively simple scenario. A more impactful scenario, if you will, is taking place in part of the National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C. There's a genetic disorder that is more likely to afflict people from Africa or Asia It can lead to heart problems, to kidney problems, but it manifests itself as well in facial features. And it turns out that facial recognition technology can often diagnose an individual, a patient who has this malady, more quickly than doctors acting alone. Or a third scenario that we have been pursuing at Microsoft, what we call Seeing AI. It's an app that uses the camera in a phone and then connects to the cloud, and it enables a person who is blind, in effect, to be told through an earpiece what is happening in the world around them, including the ability to recognize someone who might have just walked into the conference room to join a meeting. So all of these things are improving people's lives. So why have this panel? Well, it's because of the other side of the coin. And just to frame this, there's three issues that we'll have the opportunity to talk about, and no doubt more as well. But there's questions around privacy, issues around bias and discrimination, and a set of questions, issues, and concerns around human rights and democratic freedoms. So it is bursting into the public discourse, rightly so, both in terms of what tech companies are being asked to do and need to do, and what governments need to do, not just for themselves in terms of policy, but in terms of a new generation of laws and regulation. So that's what we're here to discuss. Henry?
That's great. Thank you, Brad. So Ken, why don't you start us off? We were just talking before we came out about some of the pitfalls of this, and what immediately came up was autonomous weapons with facial recognition technology. Ken said, no, well, let's talk about the more immediate risks. So Ken, why don't you take us through those?
All right. Well, first, I think it's important to recognize that, as Brad opened up, there are advantages to facial recognition technology. This is not, a matter of saying, oh, it's all evil. It really, in my view, is a matter of recognizing that there are certain problems that will arise, and you need regulation sooner rather than later, because it's very hard to walk things back. So the issue is really, what practices should we be instituting and requiring as facial recognition technology is deployed? And so let me just give you a few examples of the problems that I see. If you imagine matching facial recognition software with various psychological interpretations, which is already happening. And so, imagine you're an employer, you've got, 3,000 applications, and one thing you do is you have the facial recognition software look at the applicants and decide who is going to be a good worker, who's going to get along well with others, who reflects, the right personality for our company. You can easily imagine the biases that enter into that, because, how do you interpret, who is nice or who isn't? It's very easy for race or ethnicity or differences to enter into that calculation. You need regulation to prevent that if you're going to use this kind of psychological matching with facial recognition software. If you think about, it's not just the United States that would use this. What would China do with this? Imagine there's a demonstration, and it's impossible for the police to sit there and figure out who's there. They can try to take pictures, but it's hard to reconstruct everything. But if you do what China's trying to do, which is to create a database with everybody's face, suddenly, retroactively, you can figure out who are the dissidents. Who should you go pick up? Who do you stick in re-education? And so, you got to think globally and who might be taking this. I think that we also have to think in privacy terms, because we're not used to thinking about privacy as something that happens on the street. And especially Americans, we can get into this a bit later, but we have kind of been conditioned by the weird way that the US Supreme Court has interpreted privacy law to think that what happens in public isn't private. The terms almost seem antagonistic, antithetical. But in fact, if you think about your life, you assume a certain degree of anonymity because it's impossible for the police to keep up with you. My headquarters are in New York. If I go in the street, yes, theoretically the police can follow me, but good luck with that, with a gazillion people around. And how are they going to reconstruct my life? It would take such massive deployment of police resources that it's just not doable. So I have a certain privacy just in my anonymity in a city or in out in the world. Facial recognition software can change all of that. Because suddenly if you've got the cameras every place, you don't need a person going through all this. They can just kind of look for my face where it shows up, and they can reconstruct my life using this software. So how do we feel about that? In my view, that's impeding my privacy, even though the law is not there yet. But I think it suggests the need for regulation, because I think that this sense of privacy and anonymity is something that many of us have come to value and could be lost as facial recognition software is deployed with law enforcement agencies.
Kay and Maricha, your thoughts on this? Jump in on what you're seeing.
Well, first of all, I think it's great that Microsoft is proactively seeking this discussion. It's not easy to, on the one hand, develop technologies, and on the other hand, invite a discussion about the sensitivity. So I think that that's great. But it's not as if, and you mentioned that as well, we're starting the use of these technologies. They're already widely used. I mean, anyone who has come into Europe or the United States at an airport has to look into a camera before the gates open when you go through the security check. Or I've seen years ago the deployment of military-grade cameras in stadiums, so that there's one picture taken and retroactively there can be an assessment of whether somebody threw something onto the field or people started a scuffle or something like that. So I believe we're already past the point of assuming anonymity and privacy in public spaces, which I think is of deep concern. And we shouldn't only look at it in the context of facial recognition technologies in isolation, but really the cross-use of data. I mean, you have localization tracking on a lot of your devices. There is so much happening in an opaque, intransparent way in terms of the collection of data, the selling of data, that we need much more clarity on the purpose, the responsibility, the protection of this data. And of course, when we look at human rights, that's the first point of concern. I mean, as a member of European Parliament, there have been many occasions where I've met with human rights defenders who should be in a position to deny that they've met me, because otherwise it could have been leading to very serious consequences for them, or just in general, the freedom to do things without being tracked 24/7, even dating years back, I believe is at stake. So while I'm very happy that we're having this discussion, I think we shouldn't pretend that we can still be ahead of the curve. It's already out there. And I wish we would have had this discussion much earlier and looked at the purpose, the checks and balances, and also, actually, and maybe this is a taboo here in a business-dominated community, but to limit the use or even ban the use of these technologies in certain cases.
We'll get to the banning, but sorry, Kay, go ahead.
So yes, I wanted to echo Brad that there are some really good uses for these technologies, and obviously with my human rights background and having worked in human trafficking, one of the great success stories has been in human trafficking and helping to find victims. But also with my forum hat on, obviously I am concerned about the technologies for all the reasons that the other panelists have mentioned. Georgetown University did a report back in 2016 that said that 1 in every 2 adults was in a police database in the United States. So, that's 3 years ago now. So we need to think about the regulation, and again, I applaud Microsoft for doing this work. It's in the surveillance space, and it's also, I think, in our homes. So one of the projects that we're doing at the Forum is with UNICEF, working on devices that our children use, so AI-enabled toys with facial recognition technology, and the impact of that on our society as their data, which it should be protected, is hoovered up by these devices. So I think that we need to be thinking in the private space and in the public space.
So let me play devil's advocate a little bit, because as soon as you talk about a topic like this, privacy comes up, surveillance, everybody suddenly gets the issue of 1984 in your mind. It's going to be terrible when we're tracked all the time. But taking the perspective of honest law enforcement or journalism, where you want to actually figure out what happened, isn't it possible that it's actually good that we have cameras everywhere and that we're all sort of learning that you have to be on good human behavior all the time, because if you're not, it may immediately be exposed to the world. And in a normal circumstance like this, we tend to be polite and cordial to each other most of the time. And wouldn't this technology help with that? And shouldn't law enforcement be able to say, in the stadium, let's figure out who threw the bomb on the field or what have you? I mean, are we reacting too quickly and saying, oh, it's just going to be abused and it's terrible?
I think a lot depends on one's definition of good human behavior. I think we'd all agree that good human behavior would consist of avoiding throwing, something onto the field at a sporting event in most circumstances. But I think most people in this room would also argue that the individuals who went to the center of Kiev to argue for more democratic rights were engaged in good human behavior. Most democratic movements really turn on the ability of people to peacefully assemble, to stand up and speak for themselves. It's also a world, though, where we all know that in certain countries, people can be arrested and imprisoned or even executed if they do that. Now, today, how do people then do it? Well, it does often turn in people approaching a city square and putting a handkerchief over their face so they can't be recognized. But if there are ubiquitous cameras so that you can be recognized as soon as you step out the front door, you can be identified as soon as you put on that handkerchief, regardless of where you are, it's a very different world. And so, for example, we had an opportunity last year to do business, to provide facial recognition technology to a government that wanted to deploy it across the national capital in a country where it was clear human rights would not be protected. We didn't feel comfortable going forward with that transaction. And at the same time, when you're in business, you do have to ask yourself, does this just mean that the next company is going to do that deal? Even if the next company will, I would rather not have us do it, but I'd rather have no one do that deal. And that requires the creation of a broad set of international norms, which is not an easy task. But I think it has to start with the protection of people's rights in the countries that one always looks to protect people's rights. And in that regard, I think one of the more interesting developments in 2018 was a decision by the United States Supreme Court by 5-4 that said that the police need a search warrant in order to go access your cell phone location records. The notion is, we all travel with our phones. I mean, we all travel voluntarily with the equivalent of ankle bracelets that courts used to require an order and a finding of guilt before imposing. So the phone companies have records of everywhere we go. And so the court decided, in an opinion written by Chief Justice Roberts, that this ability to track people in public places was so intrusive that law enforcement should have to get a search warrant before obtaining that information. This is the same thing. I just think the question now is, do our faces deserve as much protection as our phones? And do we want to have a world where, as we've urged, either you require law enforcement to get an independent finding of probable cause or something similar, or you act when there is an imminent threat of death or serious injury. But there have to be some limits, or I do think we could find democratic freedoms at risk.
Well, it's not difficult to see how this is a big challenge in countries where there is no rule of law or where there are no democratic rights, but also in our own societies where the rule of law prevails. There is the notion of necessary and proportionate security measures while respecting universal human rights. The whole idea about rights being universal is that they should stand even when somebody is the suspect in the worst of all crimes. And so the whole idea that security can trump other interests, especially rights, is one that I really reject. And I think we have to also look at the rights of an individual and his or her ability to actually enforce those rights. So imagine that a facial recognition system has identified you on some kind of risk list or suspect of a crime list. How empowered are you as an individual to challenge? that notion without having the same kind of technologies. I mean, on what basis are you supposed to then defend yourself against the state, which is sort of empowered by these systems and that can, with the proper checks and balances, even access these databases? We have to also ask ourselves, how vulnerable is the individual and how are we going to make sure that he or she is protected? And on top of that, the databases that collect all this facial recognition data, we still see data breaches every week without any consequence of massive scale. There's no accountability. So I think the responsibility for companies handling this kind of sensitive data should also be part of the concerns around regulation and minimum requirements to avoid negligence and hacks of massive consequence.
If I could, I want to just pick up on the U.S. Supreme Court case that Brad mentioned and explain how revolutionary that is. Because the tradition in the United States, which sadly has shaped a lot of the rest of the world's view of these things, came from a 1979 decision, a completely different era, pre-mobile phones, where the court ruled that when I back then dialed my phone number, I had no privacy interest in the number I dialed because I shared that with the phone company. And the US government has kind of driven a truck through that narrow vision of privacy and has said, therefore, all the data that you share with the internet company, all the data you share with the phone company, all of the stuff that's in your mobile phone, no privacy interest because you shared it. So the communication itself is privacy, that's private, but whom you send it to, where you were, all this other data, the metadata, is not. And that's how you had the government scooping up all of this and saying it had a right to look at it. Now, there's been a reaction to that, and that's what this Supreme Court case reflects. Even though this, this tracking device is, I'm sharing it all with the phone company. So they know exactly where I am. I have a privacy interest in where I was. This historical data is private, absent the need for a search warrant. In other words, absent the government being able to show that there's probable cause to believe that this data is going to be indicative of a crime. And so that's the same standard that's used when the government can search my home or even arrest me. So it was a big deal to cut through this idea that sharing, if that's the right word in today's world where you, of necessity, need these devices. There's no choice in using a mobile phone. So we're not voluntarily sharing, we're just like living in the modern world. But they've cut through this view that so-called sharing is an exception to privacy. Now, we don't know where this is going. I mean, this was really a big first foray. But my guess is that whether it's the Supreme Court, and we now don't know, what we can count on with the Supreme Court, or it's going to be legislation reflecting the public's view of what privacy should be, we're going to be moving more toward a world in which the mere fact that you're not sitting there in a closet is not indicative of privacy. That you have privacy rights in a lot of things you do in the world, including, I would suggest, just walking around, absent some reason for the government to believe that you're engaged in criminal activity. So I think, where I would like to see the regulation of facial recognition software going is something similar, to require probable cause for the government to get at this. Now, you can argue, should they be able to collect the data in the first place? Where with the metadata, because the phone companies and the internet companies already have all this data, it is being stored at least for a while. The question is more, when does the government get access to it? I think in the case of facial recognition software, should they be storing that data in the first place is a question. But if they are storing it, what should they require before they get access to it? And I think some kind of warrant requirement is the way to preserve privacy at the same time as we get increasingly ubiquitous use of facial recognition software.
Well, and just briefly, what does it mean for private companies already collecting this data? So governments are bound by these checks and balances, and I think it's very valuable how this case, sheds a new light on the rights of law enforcement authorities. But if you have global companies with global access to global facial recognition and databases of faces of people all over the world, then it is great that in democracies we have laws, but it doesn't mean that companies are going to be bound by them everywhere in the world, or that we're going to restrict the use for commercial purposes the same way as for law enforcement purposes.
And so that's, I think, where I would like to come in, talking about governance, and regulation and global governance, because it takes a long time to regulate. And so one of the things that is problematic in this area is, well, by the time that 2 years has passed, which might be the time that it takes to regulate, then the problems have moved on exponentially. And so we're working at the forum on a plan for sort of agile governance in this. And we do that by bringing governments, companies, civil society, and academia together to sort of co-create some best practices or frameworks for policy, which then our government partners pilot. And so one way that I can see of perhaps beginning to tackle this is perhaps inviting the companies that you were talking about to work with us, or inviting one of our governments to use this opportunity to explore ways of creating frameworks for some regulation that doesn't have to go through Parliament or the government in order to actually start to make a difference in this space.
And how does this regulation actually happen? It's moving, the technology is moving so fast. Even in the United States, government is way behind a lot of the issues that have come up over the last 5 to 10 years. Do we wait for test cases to have the legislation happen? How does it, Brad, you said now is the time for action. How do we actually have action ahead of time?
Well, I'm hopeful that we may see some new law created in this space in 2019. And I think one of our first opportunities will be at the state level in the United States. You know, in the United States, states are the laboratories of democracy. And, you know, I don't think one needs to have the answer to every question to start legislating in the areas where answers are now clear. And so when it comes to certain issues around bias, we think that there is legislation that could spur the market in a helpful way, the protection of privacy, and the protection of democratic freedoms. There are legislative provisions. So we'll be out advocating and supporting those. Generally, when you think about privacy writ large, Europe is usually the leader in protecting privacy vis-a-vis its use by companies, and the United States is usually the leader in protecting privacy vis-a-vis its access by governments, for a lot of constitutional reasons that have to do with each continent. But I think we can sort of look to further action in these spaces. The truth is Europe has a lot of tools already under the General Data Protection Regulation, and Europe can build on those. But the truth is the data protection authorities perhaps have quite a bit of authority already with the law that is in place, and therefore can move faster.
I think generally that's a very good starting point, also illustrated by this Supreme Court case, is basically building on existing legal rights and simply saying they also extend to this technology, instead of starting from scratch, which is indeed cumbersome, lengthy, and also risks being unsustainable, because while we're talking about facial recognition today, there will be other technologies in scope in the future. The rights don't change, but the way they should be enforced through regulators and through building on existing provisions are, I believe, the way to go. Just so to look more at the core principles and then empower regulators or data protection authorities or others to sort of enforce depending on the medium or the technology that is in scope. So we should just get started. I mean, it's actually remarkable how long it has taken if you look at the use of this technology already.
And go on. Oh, certainly, the one example, going back to the AI-enabled toys, Germany simply banned these devices because they already had law on the books around espionage devices, and so they were able to say these are espionage devices within the meaning of the law. So there are some laws around and in place.
I think one of the more interesting opportunities to think about the role that law can play in a very agile way is around addressing the issue of bias. Yeah, because there's been important academic work led by some of the people in this room, that have really documented that facial recognition systems have certainly started by having higher accuracy rates for Caucasian men than for women or people of color. And when you think about it, no customer actually wants to deploy a system that is biased or discriminates. So in my view, a well-functioning market will even further spur technological advances which are underway to reduce these problems of bias. But then you have to ask, well, what does it take to have a well-functioning market? And yeah, it's instructive because in the US, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, published in November a report. And it assessed the facial recognition technologies of more than 40 companies, including from Microsoft. And it assessed the accuracy, and what it documented was tremendous advances in the technology over the course of 4 years. But not every company made its technology available for testing. In fact, there's companies that have household names that decided they weren't going to make their technology available for testing. And then you step back and say, well, in the world of automobiles, we care about automobile safety. And we're able to basically read about tests that compare the safety of automobiles. Or when you think about going to the grocery store, before you buy something, you can pick it up and you can understand what it's going to mean in terms of nutrition and the like. So laws, in effect, have required that companies in certain markets be transparent, that they publish certain information. So one thought that we happen to be very enthusiastic about is a legal provision that would require a company that wants to participate in the facial recognition technology market to first be transparent, to explain how its technology works, and second, make sure that its technology can be tested through an application programming interface or some other way by the academic community, by third-party testing services. And what is interesting from this perspective, at least to me, is we don't have to get this law passed everywhere. We just have to get it passed somewhere. Somewhere with a jurisdiction, a state in the US or a country in Europe that has enough market impact that a company says, you know what, if I'm going to be in the facial recognition business, I have to be in that jurisdiction. Therefore, I'm going to have to make my technology available for testing. And once it can be tested anywhere, then the results can be shared everywhere. So looking for opportunities where one government can move faster, accelerate market forces in a positive way on a global basis, that to me is the kind of step that we can take that will ensure this technology is used responsibly, which is fundamentally what I think most people want to see.
If I could add to what Brad is saying, and I think it's implicit in what you're saying, that yes, we want legislation, we want regulation, but now companies can be articulating the principles that they feel should lead to regulation and that will guide their own conduct in the interim. Mm-hmm. And I mean, facial recognition software is obviously just a subset of artificial intelligence. And so the standards that you're talking about are really broader AI standards. And I would go a step beyond what you've said, because yes, you want transparency and testability. That's how you begin to identify biases. And if you can't get inside the algorithm sufficiently to test biases, that's a problem. And we need to say that up front. I would go beyond that, though. I think that you need to always have the right of people to appeal if they have been adversely affected by some AI program. And you need, at that point, to have a person who hears the appeal. To say, I'm going to appeal to the AI program and it's going to spit me back an AI answer, who knows who's making what decision, not good enough. So what we need really are, a series of principles beginning with transparency and testability, but then figuring out when should people be in the loop? When can somebody victimized by the software get to a person? And are there certain decisions that we actually shouldn't be leaving with the AI software? Are there certain decisions, such as the decision to kill, which you should always have a human in the loop. You know, and this is kind of probably a different panel for later in the day, but you know, there is this, you know, with these fully autonomous weapons, which facial recognition software would be a key part. Because if you're going to, you know, set off some kind of, you know, killer robot to try to find the suspect and kill them, which is, you know, very foreseeable. We're trying to ban this, but it's quite foreseeable. How do they figure out who the person is? It's the facial recognition software. You know, and so that, you know, should you have that? Or in our view, should you always have a person in the loop before that final decision is made to kill?
And I actually would wholeheartedly agree. I mean, it's another point that we've urged, that that legislation should require that before companies use facial recognition technology to make decisions that would have this kind of important impact on people's lives, certainly the decision to kill, but you know, just the decision to let you into the country, the decision to let you into the store or the stadium, the decision to deny you credit. You know, companies should take what comes back from computers and subject it to meaningful human control, which means having individuals who are trained in how to interpret those results and have an opportunity to hear from somebody who can say, no, that is not me. That is a mistake you're about to make.
But I mean, I think these are all useful testing for consumer transparency, but the real question is, of course, one of oversight that is also irrespective of persons, because I was thinking about, you know, the past where lineups in the US were very frequently used to identify suspects in crimes, and especially when racial discrimination was still anchored in laws. There was often, you know, identification of someone on the basis of skin color because there was one person with that skin color lined up who would automatically be identified as the suspect. So people can also be biased. I mean, automatic weapons are now used by human beings in a way that we can have a lot of question marks about as well. But at the end of the day, I think a proper articulation of the rule of law in the context of new technologies requires oversight mechanisms that are sound no matter what person, no matter what government, you know, with political inclination to the left or the right is in power, but really to give redress, oversight, checks and balances mechanisms to everyone indiscriminately. And I believe that that is another level, let's say, than the testing in the interest of transparency for people to see what product they would prefer to use over the other. But it touches on each other in the sense that oversight of algorithms is becoming more and more important. And also in the interest of democracy, for example. If we look now at social media and the rankings of certain feeds, this is a very broad topic that I think is very, very urgent to be tackled.
So we have a few more minutes left. Would love to take some questions from you all, and if there aren't any, I have many more. Go ahead, sorry.
Hi, Bebop Gresta, the chairman and co-founder of Hyperloop Transportation Technologies. So my company is working on, we have incredible opportunity to work on the fifth mode of transportation. We have a white canvas to write. We're imagining the passenger of the future as a naked passenger, someone that doesn't need a ticket. The passenger of the future needs only its biometry to have a frictionless experience, enter, and by magic, through a blockchain, receive a series of services that now are not conceived. And even in the safety aspect, it will be an amazing journey. But the problem that we are facing is that this creates a real barrier to people that want, for example, to opt out, because embedded in the service, embedded in the station, embedded in everything we are imagining he will be doing, there's the concept of accepting to be monitored and to be recognized. And this conflicts a lot with my view of the world, where you always should be able to actually opt out. You always have the choice to actually say no. But a lot of the technologies that we are designing have embedded the implicit need for the user to say yes. How do you cope with this contradiction?
I mean, I think it's the same question that comes up when you move around with your tracking device. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think, you know, as a company, there are certain questions you have to ask. Do you need to store the data? So, you know, maybe you need to recognize the person, but do you need to store it any place beyond that initial drive that they take? Because obviously where you drive, are you going to your psychiatrist's office? Are you going to your HIV treatment thing? Are you going to, there are a lot of things that people do out in the public that are nonetheless private. And so, if this is the way, the key to your automobile is going to be, get rid of it then. Then you have to question, even if you have to store it for, a day or whatever, what if the government wants to come after you? And that's where we need regulations. I think it should not be just a subpoena, which is, basically a prosecutor signing a piece of paper in order to get that data. You should, if they really, if I used your car and they want to know where I went, they should require a search warrant. They should require, reason to believe, probable cause that I'm engaged in criminal activity. And that's why, it's beyond your company. If you get a subpoena, you're going to have to turn over the data. But that shouldn't be the law. The law should be that they have to give you a search warrant before you turn over that data. But even before you go there, why are you keeping the data? And I would only do that insofar as is absolutely necessary for your business purposes, not to sell it for somebody for advertising purposes or to better target the person for, so they can get them to their store next week.
Hello, I'm Joy Blumweeny, the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. We've done some of the seminal work exposing bias in facial recognition technology. We have a new paper coming out that shows Amazon has significant bias. New York Times will cover it tomorrow, but they're selling to intelligence agencies. So earlier you mentioned the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is an institution that focuses on looking at how suitable these technologies are. With the new study that came out from the National Institute for Standards and Technology, Amazon was not one of the companies that submitted, so we did our test. They are biased, gender biased, racial biased. The numbers will come out tomorrow. But I want to press on the National Institute for Standards and Technology, because if we're going to have governing agencies actually setting these standards, we have to question the standards. So if we go back and we look at NIST standards, in 2007, Facebook was really excited because they did very well on a benchmark that was a gold standard in facial recognition, 97%. When you looked at that benchmark, it was actually 77% male and over 83% white. We tested the NIST benchmarks, the earlier ones, and they were 75% male, 80% lighter skin. So even as we have these standards, we have to make sure that when the reports are coming out, that we have the demographic information. And this matters especially when we're talking about what kind of bans or limitations we have, because we could have a false sense of progress. So then going to where we should have bans, I believe there should be a...
Joy, Brad, do you want to address that?
No, I would just... First of all, I don't have anything to say about Amazon, but no, it's actually good to have scrutiny of the standards and even to have alternatives among standards, because you're right, Joy. We all get excited when we do well on a benchmark, but if the benchmark isn't particularly good, we probably shouldn't get too excited.
Absolutely. So now to the moratoriums, because earlier we were talking about lethal autonomous weapons, but we should think about other lethal applications. So this is where a moratorium for law enforcement should exist right now, given everything we know about the biases. A company called Axon is providing or is looking to provide facial analysis technology on police-worn body cameras. So we also need to think about areas where lethal application may be contemplated if we're going to be using this technology. So an example in the UK where they've actually done numbers in the real world beyond the benchmarks, Big Brother Watch UK, May 2018, showed false positive match rates of over 90%. False matches for real-world deployments, more than 2,400 innocent people being mismatched. And there was even a young black man who was stopped. He was asked for his ID, presented the ID, but they didn't believe him, right? So there's a case going on. So moving forward, what can we do as a global community to actually think through where these bans can be initially? We have something called the Safe Face Pledge that 3 companies have already taken to say they won't apply facial analysis technology to lethal autonomous weapons. I'm the chairwoman for the International Standards for Facial Analysis Technology. So if you're interested, I invite you to join. But I want to know more about what you're thinking we can do, particularly around bans and categorical areas we shouldn't address.
Well, I actually think that it is important to identify certain scenarios where we feel that either the technology isn't yet sufficiently mature to be used well, meaning without risks of bias, or where we don't think the technology should be used without meaningful human control, or in some cases where we don't think the technology should be used at all. And yeah, it's sort of a natural phenomenon, I think, as you start getting into this kind of field, that you start to learn on a case-by-case basis. And yeah, I actually applaud the work that you're doing, Joy, and others are doing to sort of push everybody to think harder. What we're finding as we go through this is we start working with potential customers, and they come and they say, we want to deploy this technology. And we sit down with them, and I'll give you two real-world scenarios. Which is why I sometimes find that categorical bans can be too broad to really quite work effectively. One was a law enforcement scenario that wanted to use facial recognition technology within a prison. So it had a very small community of people, relatively speaking, people in their hundreds. And they wanted to do it so that when people were moving from one part of the prison, they were tracking people and they knew where the prisoners were. And we looked at that. We concluded that there wasn't a risk of bias, that you could have a high accuracy rate. You already had people whose freedom was by definition limited, and the law enforcement agency, the Corrections Bureau, was using it in a way that we felt comfortable with. And at the same time, we had another scenario, a law enforcement agency, a police department, that wanted to use facial recognition technology to literally take a picture of everyone who was pulled over in a car for any purpose whatsoever to decide whether there was a match and the person ought to be taken downtown for further questioning for other crimes. And in that second situation, we concluded that the risk of bias was such that in all probability, people would be taken downtown for crimes that they never committed because they would be misidentified. And so we sat down with that police department and we said, look, this is not a scenario where we would be comfortable providing you with our technology. We also said, this is a scenario where we don't think you should be comfortable using this technology for this purpose. And at the same time, we said, we'll work with you so that you can see how the technology evolves, and we can talk and you can learn about all of the different considerations that are going to need to be thought about in the future. So yeah, I think it's really important for the businesses in this space to be thoughtful and responsible, and for certain uses to go forward and certain uses not. Now, it does get a little challenging because, of course, we look at different pledges, including yours, of course, and we sort of say, yeah, we can sort of get comfortable with 92% of it. And then there's the 8% where we might say, no, we think that a different approach, it might make sense, at least to us. I think what it really points to overall, in our view, is we want this technology to be used responsibly. And it requires that the people who develop it and deploy it actually think hard about the questions that are being created. And in the world today, what we don't want to see, among other things, is what we would call a race to the bottom. Where the companies that are responsible end up losing business to a market that can tip because of the data-intensive nature of this business to companies that either decide, I'll say, not to be responsible, or more likely, they just don't think at all. They just have a philosophy that says, hey, if it's legal, I'll provide it, and if people don't like it, they'll make it illegal. I think that could be very problematic for the world. And so, it's good for all of us to be pushed, is sort of where I would leave it.
Well, I just wanted to look at your question a little bit differently because you mentioned the sort of false positives, which is to some extent a flaw in the technology, right? But let's assume that the technology works perfectly and ever better. So let's say that facial recognition can determine whether you're LGBT or not. And the consequences that that would have in certain countries if people cannot, prevent that from being used to be put in prison or to be persecuted another way. So I think we should not only look at, false positives, which is a big challenge, and if it's not working well, obviously government should wonder whether it's useful at all. But also assume what happens when it works perfectly. And there, I believe we need benchmarks for minimum standards that don't depend on the goodwill of companies or their positioning in the space of acting responsibly or not, because there will always be companies that are happy to engage in the race to the bottom. We'll see that. And there will always be countries where authorities don't care about false positives because it's just fine to arrest 5 more people without a probable cause. Why not? It happens every day, whether it's on the basis of facial recognition or not. So I believe democratic countries, countries that are based on the rule of law, should really set the standard here, work with companies to push out these standards, work with civil society or expert initiatives and whatnot, to really have multi-stakeholder initiatives to put these minimal benchmarks in place before it's too late, and to also show leadership here. This is not a technology that has to wash over us and we are all defenseless, even though, of course, the data will be collected about people. It's also about how long it can be stored, for what purposes it can be used, and I would predict that there will be more regulation towards the specific use rather than the technology in general, also because it's already out there. The cat is out of the bag. You can't really put it back in.
We're almost out of time, but Ken, Kay, do you have any more final comments?
Let me just say that I think that when the race to the bottom argument comes up, some companies, and I'm not saying Microsoft here, use this as an argument to just say, well, what's the point because somebody else is going to undercut us. Yeah. We'll just get the business. And the answer in those kind of situations is to push for laws or regulations. It's not to engage in the race to the bottom. And we've seen in various situations, including transfer of technology, that actually can work, and that the shaming of those who do run for the bottom can be, a way of trying to deter them. In terms of, what are possible bans, I mean, Joy, I think, what you're talking about, really, given the state of the software today, it's not deploying it where there's going to be immediate actionable use. In other words, when you have sort of retrospective use with a search warrant, there's many more safeguards than just to put it on a police officer's jacket and have arrest decisions made on that basis. We also really need bans on certain kinds of governments, and this is implicit in what you're saying. But if you think about the classic dystopia today, China's social credit index, where using facial recognition software combined with a bunch of other data that they collect, they're going to be giving people scores that are basically indicative of political and social reliability that will determine where you get to live, where you get to send your kids to school, do you even get to take the bullet train or get a passport or go to the hot new show in town. I mean, so it's a method of social control that doesn't require prison, but that is using all of this new ability to collect data about you. And I think the answer in those situations should be don't sell it to them. Now China's developing their own. But you can imagine, little China's popping up around the world. The Microsofts of the world should not be facilitating that.
And then just finally, to really say that we are at the forum working on some form of global governance. And Brad we're pleased to joins as co-chair of the Global AI Council. To really think about some of these issues with countries and business and civil society and academics. And I am actively seeking to recruit a country to pilot some of these regulations that we've been talking about in facial recognition. So hopefully we will make some progress this year.
Thank you all very much for coming. It's great to have you, and thanks to our panel. That was wonderful.